what we're trying to do now is to utilize a format that I very frequently use, which is to kind of build an inroad into a concept by sort of circling the mountain and then climbing it from many different angles. My feeling is that if we take simply one tactic to describe the Guru Yoga or anything that is ultimately a very abstract and profound concept, that somehow we won't get it all. It's very difficult, particularly in this culture, which is not acclimated to the practice or understanding of Guru Yoga, to make such a transition. It's much easier instead for us to translate one religious context that we know and understand into another religious context and think because we've translated certain terminologies and certain words that we've actually understood. And that may not be the case. So instead, a good thing to do, and something that I found very useful, is to explain a concept again from 360 different degrees or all the way around the mountain if you can, and then also use and apply concepts that are relevant and familiar to our lives. So in this way, we can begin to prepare our minds by sort of loosening up former tight concepts. We can begin by recognizing certain elements within the teaching that apply to our life. We can begin to simply back off from what we have taken to be absolutely true and therefore what has become invisible, and reassess. And that will provide something like a softening or a receptiveness to our mind, to our consciousness, that later when we enter into the retreat will be beneficial. And even for those of us who will not attend the retreat, and I can't imagine there's any of you here that would think that way, even those of us that may not attend the retreat, still these teachings will be useful and will help to prepare us for a time in the future when we can understand the same teachings. So now we are continuing to prepare ourselves for the Guru Yoga. And in order to do that, we might want to look at where we are right now. According to the Buddhist teachings and according to everything that we can surmise from the information we receive as we travel along the path, we are now, as sentient beings, in a state of non-recognition. That non-recognition, it's interesting because when you hear a term like that, it's hard to really understand what it means. When we think of the word recognizing, we think in more superficial terms, I recognize you, you recognize me. We recognize people that we are familiar with. So that concept still holds true, but there needs to be maybe a more deeper, more able way to understand what non-recognition actually means according to the Buddhist philosophy. According to Buddhist philosophy, we contain within us the seed that is Buddha nature. It is not smaller than the Buddha's nature. It is not bigger than the Buddha's nature. It is not different than the Buddha's nature. It is the same. It is that nature inherent within us that is the primordial wisdom state or the natural ground of being. That is our nature. As we move toward enlightenment, we don't construct that nature. It doesn't become complete. It doesn't become bigger. It simply is what it is, but we move from a state of non-recognition into a state that the Buddha clearly described as being awake. And that's the only difference. We tend to think in a materialistic way even about those things that are very subtle, very pure, very profound, and very spiritual. We tend to think perhaps that the Buddha or a great bodhisattva or even one's teacher has a bigger Buddha nature than we do. Somehow it's bigger and maybe more muscle-bound or stronger, or something like that. Maybe it's worked out and it's fit. We don't have any real idea, but something like that. We tend to think that maybe in a materialistic society, we measure things. So at the risk of being crude, we wonder if the teacher's isn't bigger than ours. And that being the case, Well, I said it was a risk. But according to the Buddhist teaching, that is not the case. The simple difference is recognition. Simply that, recognition. One is not different from the other. So as ordinary sentient beings, we are locked in a state of non-recognition. And that non-recognition is so all-pervasive that it becomes invisible. It's simply invisible. And it's very much like, I've used this analogy many times before, being born on a merry-go-round. If no one ever stops the merry-go-round and you spend your whole life on the merry-go-round, you will never know that you're on it. You will never know anything else other than that reality. Our condition of non-recognition is very much like that. It's always been this way. We project everything outward onto a screen. Our awareness seems constructed in that way. We know no other way to be aware. And so that is the dilemma of sentient beings. We wish to awaken as the Buddha is awake. We wish to come to understand our true nature, our primordial wisdom nature, which is the ground of being, and yet we are locked in a state of non-recognition. I would like to digress from the Guru Yoga, so it seems, but it not really, and we will come back to it as soon as possible. Long enough to mention that, for instance, there is one practice that we do in order to prepare for the time of death, that many of you have already taken this practice before, and some of you will have that opportunity later on. This practice is called POA, and it is actually the transference of consciousness from ignorance into bliss. We practice clearing the central channel, opening up the psychic apertures that block us, coming into a state of awareness of what the death experience actually is, and we actually practice ejecting the consciousness or sending the consciousness through the central channel so that at the time of death we can die consciously. That means to say, not simply have the experience of death overtake us the way life has overtaken us, but rather to die intelligently, participating in the transference of consciousness from ignorance to bliss through the ejection through the central channel. In this practice of POA, we are taught the first events that happen in the Bardo state as we enter into the Bardo. Now again, it seems like I'm not talking about Guru Yoga, but bear with me. I always get back to my subject, eventually. So, at the time of death, when the outer breath ceases, there is a period of time between that and when the inner or more subtle breath ceases. That time varies according to the conditions of the conditions surrounding the death, the condition of the person's mind stream, the karma of the person, habitual tendencies. There are many different factors. But when death actually occurs and all of the breath ceases, both inner and the outer breath, rather, that is very visible and measurable through watching whether the breath has stopped or not, through holding a mirror in front of the nose, that kind of thing. When that happens, and then when the inner subtle psychic winds stop, at that moment there are three events that happen that are very important, and it's critical as a Buddhist that we understand this, think about this intelligently, prepare for it, make choices. The first event is the disengagement of the white bodhicitta, or male spiritual essence that we inherit from our fathers, that we perceive to be seminal substance, but is actually the white bodhicitta in its mystical form. And as we move toward enlightenment, we begin to understand that. That white bodhicitta disengages and drops from the top of the head to the heart area of the central channel. And when that happens, there is a corresponding vision in the Bardo state as we enter into the Bardo state called the white vision. That white vision has two aspects. There are two results. We prepare and we learn for that. And when you practice POA, we will go into that more deeply. The second event that happens is the raising up the central channel of the female bodhicitta, or the red bodhicitta, which is the mother's contribution. And that red bodhicitta rises at the time of death in the same way to the central channel. And at that time we have the corresponding vision, which is called the red vision. That red vision has two aspects and two results. And again, you will also learn about that when we study POA again, which we do periodically. But the event that I'm talking about primarily is the event that occurs when these two substances, this red and white bodhicitta, meet in the central channel. When that happens, there is the clear or black vision. And that particular vision is extremely important because while everything in the bardo depends upon our capability to move from a state of non-recognition into a state of recognition, then everything depends on that in the bardo. And we use, and every method really that we practice in Vajrayana is geared toward providing that kind of recognition, both in the waking state and especially in this most glorious, opportune time, which is the time when the worldly, life-bearing constituents dissolve, and we are in that state that I'm describing, where the red and white bodhicitta meet. That state is a very fortuitous state. It is to the excellent practitioner, to the practitioner who understands the point of the path and who has actually practiced and has come to some accomplishment, that moment is a tremendous opportunity. And the excellent practitioner will look forward to that moment. Really, the extraordinary practitioner, the excellent practitioner, will look forward to that moment more than they do any event in their lives. Because that moment is the moment of the most strong potential recognition. Of course, a mediocre practitioner will go, well, you know, it sounds good to me, but I don't know, I'd rather vacation in the Bahamas or something like that. You know, the mediocre practitioner will have perhaps less fear about it. It would gradually be less according to their level of competency. But still there would be some fear and trepidation, and there is always a question as to whether or not that state of recognition could possibly occur at that moment. And for the non-practitioner, that state is a complete unknown. It simply is a complete unknown. Now, why, to the practitioner, is this such a tremendous opportunity, and why is it a completely different experience to the non-practitioner? The non-practitioner is basically in the same position in that state and at that moment that any sentient being is during any confused or deluded time during their lives when they are in an ongoing state of non-recognition, thinking that I am this thing that is contained right here in this box in flesh, and you are out there totally separate from me, and there is no connection. That state of non-recognition is the state in which it appears that I am here, I am this, and that is that. It is the mind of duality. It is the mind that separates self from other. It is the mind that experiences acceptance or rejection, hope or fear, hope and fear generally at the same time, mixed up. There are many different ways to determine what our consciousness is like in a state of non-recognition. Simply look at what your mind is doing now. Right now, even as you're listening to me, there's at least one other voice in your head. Who's talking? How can that happen? If we were awake as the Buddha is awake, we would understand that that is not even logical. Coming from the perspective of enlightenment, of realization, of awakening, we would understand that that is not realistic at all. It cannot be. It would not be. So this state of non-recognition is the state in which we remain seemingly in a certain solid condition where everything else other than our perception of self-nature seems to be projected outward and seems to be happening to us. And because of that, events happen to us. Life happens to us. We seem to be both victim and oppressor, and we seem to experience both the result and the condition of both. And according to where we are at that particular moment in our lives, we will either think ourselves to be the victim or will seem to be the oppressor. But there is actually, according to the Buddha's teaching, nothing that is actually happening other than the primordial wisdom nature that is the ground of being, along with its display, which is very much like the rays of the sun and their relationship with the sun itself. The dance, the movement, the display of that nature is also as much a part of that nature as the sun's rays are of the sun. Yet we experience things in an extremely diluted way. Everything seems to be separated, categorized, dualistic. And so we are lost in a state of non-recognition, not able to understand who or what we are or how things actually occur. Now, in the time in Poa when the red and white bodhicitta come together, what actually happens is that all the constituents, the material constituents that, or subtly material constituents, I should say, that bind us to our experience, that bind us in this physical reality into like a time and space grid or a sense of continuum. At the time of death, these constituents naturally dissipate. The body is ceasing its activity, and yet that which we have called I, which seems to have existed since time out of mind, we do not perceive to disappear into nothing. We perceive that that sense of I continues and remains, mostly due to ego clinging and desire, to the idea of self-nature as being inherently real. However, at the time of death, again, when this red and white bodhicitta come together, there is this brief period of time when all of these constituents dissolve. And it's almost like the space between inhale and exhale. There is a moment when there is, again, this is a diluted way to carry this information, and that's unfortunate because our language is not made to carry enlightenment. It's only made to carry delusion. So forgive me for that, but there is a moment where, in a sense, it's as though the constituents dissolve, but there is this pause between the inhalation and the exhalation where nothing new actually arises quite yet. Even though we are still lost in that state of believing in self-nature as being inherently real, some sort of subtle reassembly has not actually occurred just yet. The constituents have simply dissolved, and there is a moment of pause. Now, for most people, now you get this, you have to be real about this. For most people at that time, for most sentient beings across the board at that time, 99.9% of sentient beings who have not had the opportunity or for whatever reason did not practice to the point of accomplishment, some kind of level of accomplishment, at that point will not be able, once the constituents disengage, to recognize what is. The components that cause us to engage in this automatic projection of our karma and mind streams into external experience has ceased. Nothing else has arisen as something. So there is a pause. To the ordinary practitioner, at that time, consciousness simply takes goes into what is very much like a fainting or sleeping state. That is the experience of dying. It seems as though something ends, but there is no recognition of the primordial ground of being, which is our nature, that is actually momentarily revealed at that time. Revealed just as clear as it can ever be. Now here again, listen to the language of delusion. Clear as it can ever be. If we could conceptualize that nature as an it, we'd probably be able to see it at that time. But the constituents have dissolved, and we are simply seeing the naked reality, the naked face of the ground of being that is our nature. As non-accomplishers, as those who are still awake, we do not recognize that moment. And it appears to us that it is simply over. It has ended. We have had a certain white vision, and there's a feeling of moving through a tunnel and all that stuff they wrote in the books. So a lot of it's right. But they don't tell you about the part that happens after that, which is the red vision, and then that experience of dying. And then the actual, as we arise from that, because it is our habitual tendency to do so since time out of mind. We're not talking about 75, 80 years. We're talking about since time out of mind, inconceivable time that you cannot name, count, or measure. We have conceived of self-nature as being inherently real. So naturally, habitual tendency simply asserts itself. And then we continue to go through the bardo, again projecting consciousness outward, but without the rules and regulations associated with physical life. It's a very different experience. But what about that precious moment? What happens to people, to sentient beings who are actually very good practitioners or perhaps even accomplished bodhisattvas? At that moment, when all of the constituents dissolve, then comes the face that is, to the practitioner, recognized as the clear, contrived, natural, conditionless state. That is our nature. That state which is literally free of any and all condition, and therefore cannot be described, which is fundamentally complete, and yet without beginning or end. That state which is free of discrimination, free of any kind of determining factor, free of time and space as we know it, free of anything that we can name as distinction or condition. At that moment, that state is revealed, and for the practitioner, it is as intimate, precious. How can you say beyond intimate? So close as to be beyond your breath, beyond your blood, beyond your marrow, as you understand it as physical beings. That state then when the constituents all dissolve, is suddenly tasted, understood, recognized. Is the only word that works, really. Recognized in the same way that a child will recognize its mother, and a mother will recognize its child. Those of you that have been parents, particularly women, I think, have this kind of experience that more frequently. It's not to say that men don't have this experience, but women, I talk to women, they seem to have this experience of having birthed a child, and that child it's a mind bend almost, to see something that was inside of you and now it's outside of you and you know it. There's this thing that happens, you know it, you smell the genetics, you see it, you can, it's there. And in the same way as a child begins to move towards its first cognition, the first thing it reacts to, and you can see this in newborn infants, they will start to look for the sound of their mother's voice, and even be comforted by being held in the mother's lap close to the chest because they recognize the mother's heartbeat rhythm. This deep, intimate, beyond intimate recognition doesn't even touch the recognition that happens to the qualified practitioner or bodhisattva when the constituents dissolve and we are free to see our true face. Because that face is not separate. That nature that is revealed at that moment, simply because nothing else is going on, is more intimate than the experience that I have just described. And again, those of you that have born children and know what this is that I'm talking about can really relate. And others of you can relate in your own deep, inmost experience, perhaps remembering from your own childhood. The revelation of that arising is so intimate and so profound. And it is that revelation that we look to accomplish. Is that that we try to understand that that's the game plan here. That's what we wish to accomplish. Is that at the time of death, when the constituents dissolve, we will arise not from the darkness filled with desire and habitual tendency continuing through the bardo and through samsara like a bee in a jar, like we always do, but instead arising once the constituents dissolve in this state of recognition. And this state of recognition must be understood to be the same as what the Buddha described when he described, I am awake. This is a state that brings us to awakening. That is what awake is, that recognition. So for the excellent practitioner, the hope is that at that moment, we will recognize that which is not separate. What is that thing that we recognize at that time? It's not a thing. It's no thing. Nothing. It is no thing, and yet it is that which is the ground essence that is our nature, the ground of being. Aren't those provocative words? The ground of being. We're not talking about some external divine reality that we have to go towards. We're not going towards the light, It's not what we're doing here. It is the recognition of that nature that is the ground of being. That ground of being that is our nature. In that state, indistinguishable. One cannot determine the appearance of phenomena or the appearance of self-nature, the difference between. One cannot see differences. That recognition is of our true state, our true nature, which is that which is free of such distinctions. Now, what has this got to do with Guru Yoga? Guru Yoga is one of the methods that we use to accomplish that precious moment. In this day, in this time, during this time called Kali Yuga, during this time of intense confusion, when in our being's discursive mind, discursive thought runs rampant out of control, when even the reality that we are projecting onto our environment becomes progressively more and more decadent. In this time, Vajrayana has appeared in the world. And according to the teachings of Guru Rinpoche, this is the best practice for this time, most potent and most powerful. It relies on a very strong ripening. It relies on the very condition of Kali Yuga when things are becoming more and more contracted. And yet the obstacle that we face, and here's where we need to prepare for our retreat, not only our retreat, the heck with a retreat, we need to prepare for our lives and for our death. Here's where we really need to prepare, and yet the obstacle that arises is that we do not understand the Guru Yoga. We do not understand why we should practice it, or how it might lead to this moment. Oh yes, we want to awaken. We want to move into a state of recognition once we understand what concept means. But we don't want to practice the Guru Yoga. And the reason why is that in our materialistic society, we have negative programming concerning some ideas about Guru Yoga. We're brought up in a democratic society, in a materialistic society, and we have certain rules that we learn that we apply wrongly to this situation. Now, I think these rules are good. These rules teach us that we should think for ourselves, that we should be independent. You could not get anyone in this world to agree with that more than me. I am a Brooklyn girl. I do not believe in following anything blindly. I do not believe that to be strictly dogmatic, with no understanding and no ability to determine for oneself what is true and what is right, is completely absurd. I agree, although it's an arrogant thing to say, with the Buddhist teaching. Plain and simple. If I didn't, what would it matter? But I do. And the Buddha taught us that we should determine everything for ourselves. But we apply this wrongly, and I'm going to talk about how we should actually apply this to the practice of Guru Yoga. In the practice of Guru Yoga, absolutely, we should think for ourselves. And we should do all the other things that are obstacles to the practice of Guru Yoga. But we should not do them here. We should think for ourselves. We should be smart people. We should not go brain dead. We should not blindly follow the leader. And we should not think that this is simply a translation of another religion where if you just do lots of prostrations and act like you're brain dead around your teacher and go completely limp in your head, you know, walking around like this all the time, and say, I believe, save me, I believe. In our religion, if you do that, there won't be much result. So I don't recommend doing that. Because in our religion, we believe in cause and effect relationships. And in order to achieve that state of recognition, one has to apply the causes that will produce that result. In the same way that in order to get an apple, you have to plant an apple seed, to get an apple tree, to get an apple. Until they develop those replicators like they have on Star Trek. Ain't no way. And I have no idea how they're going to teach Dharma once that happens. Because this is the teaching that we have, this is what we have been taught. The seed always produces the fruit. Now, in order to accomplish this state of recognition, this precious awakened state, we have to have practiced, we have to have applied the causes by which the mind is ripened and ready for such a thing. Now again, one doesn't do that by simply being a good little boy or girl, or being spiritual person, meek and mild. It is through practicing, and one such practice is the practice of Guru Yoga. When correctly done, it can lead to this result of recognition, because we begin to understand in the practice of Guru Yoga that the practice applied is not one of submission to another person's will, or acting as though you're a nobody and the teacher is a somebody, or acting as though you're a kid and the teacher is mama, or simply following things around in some sort of mindless way, but rather in the appropriate practice of Guru Yoga, there are certain determinations that one must make. And then after that, I will explain how this practice is used to bring about that moment.